The absent old lady, my name tag read at my granddaughter's wedding, even though I had paid for the ballroom, the flowers, and half the honeymoon suite overlooking the Pacific. I stood frozen near the reception entrance while guests in designer dresses and dark tailored suits brushed past me carrying champagne flutes and gift envelopes wrapped in silver ribbon. For a moment, I honestly thought there had been some kind of mistake. The young woman at the check-in table smiled politely when she handed me the cream-colored card, completely unaware that the words printed in elegant gold lettering felt like a knife sliding quietly between my ribs. I forced myself to smile back. My fingers trembled slightly as I pinned the tag onto my pale blue jacket. At 69 years old, I had learned that public humiliation rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it arrives softly, dressed in satin and calligraphy. "Grandma Evelyn," my granddaughter Chloe called from across the ballroom. Her white wedding gown shimmered beneath the crystal chandeliers as she hurried toward me with photographers trailing behind her. She kissed my cheek quickly, careful not to smudge her makeup. "You made it," she said, distracted already, glancing over her shoulder toward the bridal party. I looked into her eyes, searching for some sign that she had nothing to do with the name tag. But all I found was nervousness. Not guilt. Not surprise. Just nervousness. "Of course I made it," I replied softly. "I wouldn't miss your wedding." Before she could answer, Vanessa appeared beside her in a fitted emerald green gown that probably cost more than my first car back in 1978. My daughter-in-law smelled faintly of expensive perfume and white roses. She wrapped one manicured hand around Chloe's arm possessively before turning toward me with that polished smile she reserved for charity events and church fundraisers. "Evelyn, there you are," she said warmly enough for nearby guests to hear. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd actually show up." A few people chuckled politely. I heard it. Vanessa heard it too. Her smile widened just slightly. I touched the name tag pinned to my chest. "Interesting choice of wording," I said calmly. Her eyes flickered downward toward the card for only a second before she gave a tiny shrug. "Oh goodness, those were printed by the wedding planner. You know how these companies are." She laughed lightly, dismissively, already guiding Chloe away before I could respond. "Come on, sweetheart, the photographer needs you." And just like that, they disappeared back into the glowing crowd while I remained standing alone near the entrance like an afterthought at the very celebration I had helped build. The ballroom at the Monterey Grand Hotel looked like something from a bridal magazine. White orchids draped from tall gold centerpieces. Candlelight reflected off polished marble floors. Somewhere in the distance, a string quartet played soft jazz arrangements of old love songs Frank used to hum while washing dishes on Sunday mornings. My late husband would have hated this kind of extravagance. He used to say weddings should be about love, not performance. But Vanessa believed every family moment was an opportunity for status. Bigger flowers. Bigger venue. Bigger photos for social media. I slowly walked toward my assigned table near the back corner of the ballroom, far from the family tables near the dance floor. A small white card marked my seat between two distant relatives I barely recognized. From where I sat, I could see Chloe laughing beside Vanessa, while guests gathered around them like orbiting planets around a bright artificial sun. Not one person approached me. Not Daniel. Not Chloe. Not even the cousins whose tuition bills I had quietly helped pay years ago when their parents were struggling. A waiter stopped beside my chair and offered champagne. "No thank you," I said gently. My throat already felt tight enough. Across the ballroom, I noticed a giant projection screen displaying family photos of Chloe growing up. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. Graduation pictures. Vanessa appeared in almost every image smiling proudly beside her daughter. But as the slideshow continued, I realized something strange. I was barely there. 30 years of birthdays, school recitals, beach vacations, and Sunday dinners reduced to too blurry photographs hidden between hundreds of carefully selected memories. I stared at the screen while something cold settled quietly inside my chest. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a joke either. Someone had spent months rewriting the story of this family. And somehow, in their version, I had already disappeared. The music grew louder as more guests filled the ballroom, but from my table in the far corner, everything sounded strangely distant, as though I were listening through a closed door. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap while waiters carried silver trays of crab cakes and champagne through the sea of laughter and polished smiles. Every few minutes, Someone walked past my table without noticing me at all. It was a peculiar feeling, becoming invisible in a room I had helped pay for. I glanced again toward the giant projection screen hanging beside the dance floor. The slideshow continued cycling through carefully curated family memories. Chloe at age 6 wearing a pink ballet costume. Chloe graduating high school. Chloe posing beside Vanessa in matching white sweaters during a ski trip to Aspen. The audience smiled warmly at each image, completely unaware that entire chapters of our family history had been erased. There were no photographs from the summers Chloe spent at my lake cabin in Oregon learning how to fish with Frank. No Christmas mornings in my old colonial house where she used to fall asleep beside the fireplace waiting for cinnamon rolls to finish baking. No photographs from the year Daniel lost his job and Chloe practically lived with me, while Vanessa chased real estate seminars across California. It was as if someone had taken scissors to my life and trimmed me out piece by piece. "Mind if I sit here?" a soft voice asked beside me. I looked up to see Margaret Doyle lowering herself carefully into the empty chair across from mine. Her silver hair was pinned neatly beneath a navy fascinator, and her reading glasses hung from a delicate gold chain around her neck. Margaret and I had been friends for nearly 40 years. We met teaching 3rd grade in Sacramento back when both our husbands still had dark hair and strong knees. I was beginning to think I was the only person over 60 in this room, she whispered with a dry smile. I laughed softly for the first time all evening. "Apparently older people are decorative now," I replied. Margaret's eyes drifted briefly toward my name tag. Her smile faded almost immediately. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "did you approve that?" I looked down at the card pinned against my jacket. Under the warm ballroom lights, the gold lettering almost sparkled. "No," I answered simply. Margaret inhaled slowly through her nose, clearly choosing her next words with caution. "I heard a few women near the bar talking earlier. Vanessa told several people you were rarely involved in Chloe's life." I stared at her without speaking. "She said Chloe practically raised herself because you were always absent," Margaret continued quietly. "I knew it was nonsense, of course. But Evelyn, people believe what they hear repeatedly." Something cold settled deeper inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Felt more like clarity. The kind that arrives after months of subtle discomfort finally forms a complete picture. I thought back to the last 3 years. The canceled Sunday dinners. The family vacations I somehow learned about afterward through social media. The birthdays moved to restaurants 2 hours away without anyone telling me until the last minute. Every incident had seemed small on its own. Easy to excuse. Easy to forgive. But sitting there beneath the soft golden lights of that ballroom, I realized none of it had been accidental. Vanessa had been quietly removing me from the family portrait long before tonight. Across the room, Daniel stood near the bar speaking with several men in expensive suits. My son looked older than his 52 years. His shoulders slumped slightly the way Frank's used to after difficult months at the accounting firm. For a moment I considered walking over to him and asking directly if he knew what Vanessa had done. But then I watched him laugh nervously at something one of the men said while avoiding eye contact with me entirely. That answered the question better than words could have. Margaret leaned closer across the table. "There is something else you should know," she said quietly. I turned toward her. "Earlier this evening, I overheard Vanessa speaking with the wedding coordinator. She mentioned that your contribution barely covered the floral arrangements." I blinked once, certain I had misunderstood. "The floral arrangements alone cost nearly $12,000, I said. "Exactly," Margaret replied. "But she told people Chloe and Daniel paid for almost everything themselves." I looked around the ballroom again. The towering orchids. The imported candles. The marble dance floor wrapped in white roses. 6 months earlier, Vanessa had sat in my kitchen crying over wedding expenses while promising me Chloe deserved one beautiful day after such a stressful year. I remembered writing the checks myself. $40,000 from the savings Frank and I had built slowly over decades. Money meant for retirement trips we would never take now. My throat tightened, but I kept my face calm. Across the ballroom, Vanessa lifted her champagne glass while guests gathered around her like she was royalty. She smiled brightly beneath the chandeliers, completely comfortable wearing a life stitched together from other people's sacrifices. And for the first time all evening I stopped feeling hurt. Heard implied surprise. What I felt now was something far more dangerous. I was beginning to understand exactly who she was. Dinner service began shortly after sunset, and the ballroom lights dimmed until everything glowed gold and amber beneath the crystal chandeliers. A pianist near the dance floor started playing slow instrumental versions of classic love songs, while waiters placed porcelain plates in front of the guests with rehearsed precision. The scent of rosemary steak and buttered asparagus drifted through the room, but I barely noticed the food. I kept watching the people instead. It is remarkable how much truth reveals itself when you stop trying to defend people you love. From my seat in the corner, I noticed Vanessa moving gracefully from table to table, touching shoulders lightly, laughing at the right moments, leaning close whenever she spoke. She looked less like the mother of the bride and more like a politician campaigning for votes. Every conversation seemed carefully designed, every smile calculated. At one point, she stopped beside a group of older women wearing diamonds large enough to pay off mortgages. I recognized one of them as the mother of the groom. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly, though not enough to prevent nearby guests from overhearing. "Families are complicated," she said with a delicate sigh. But Chloe learned a long time ago not to expect too much from certain people. One of the women glanced briefly in my direction before quickly looking away. Vanessa followed her gaze for half a second, then offered a sad little smile meant to communicate dignity and restraint. The message was perfectly clear. Poor Vanessa, forced to manage a difficult elderly relative while protecting the family. I sat perfectly still while heat crept slowly into my chest. Not rage. Something steadier. Something colder. Margaret reached for her wine glass beside me. "She is building a performance," she murmured quietly. "And everyone here is applauding it." I looked across the ballroom again. Chloe stood near the wedding cake posing for photographs beside her new husband, Ethan Collins. He seemed polite enough, though slightly overwhelmed by Vanessa's constant involvement in every detail. The poor young man probably thought he was marrying into a warm, successful family. He had no idea he was standing inside a carefully staged illusion. The wedding planner suddenly approached our table holding a clipboard against her chest. Her smile looked tense now, stretched too tightly at the edges. "Mrs. Harper," she asked softly, "would it be possible to speak privately for just a moment?" Margaret glanced at me cautiously as I rose from my chair. The young woman guided me toward a quiet hallway near the ballroom entrance where the music became muffled behind heavy ivory curtains. Up close she looked exhausted. Tiny beads of sweat glistened along her hairline despite the cool coastal air drifting through the lobby. "I am terribly sorry to bother you tonight," she began nervously, "but there seems to be some confusion regarding several outstanding balances." I blinked slowly. "Outstanding balances?" She lowered her voice further. "Mrs. Collins assured us additional payments would clear this afternoon, but several transfers have not gone through." For a moment I simply stared at her. "I paid Vanessa 6 months ago," I said carefully. $40,000. The wedding planner swallowed hard. "According to our records, only $12,000 was applied toward the venue account." A strange silence filled the hallway. Somewhere behind us, guests laughed as glasses clinked together inside the ballroom. $12,000. I repeated the number quietly inside my head, while pieces of the puzzle shifted into place with terrifying speed. The fake sympathy, the rewritten family history, the missing photographs, the constant reminders that I was supposedly uninvolved. Vanessa was not just humiliating me socially. She was preparing the ground beneath something larger. Before I could respond, Vanessa herself appeared at the far end of the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against polished marble floors. The moment she saw the wedding planner standing beside me, her expression changed almost invisibly. Not panic. Calculation. "There you are," she said brightly as she approached us. "Everyone is looking for the grandmother of the bride." The planner immediately stepped back uncomfortably. Vanessa turned toward her with a calm, practiced smile. "I already explained that the bank is processing the final transfers. Surely we can avoid discussing financial matters during a wedding reception." Her tone remained pleasant, but underneath it sat a warning sharp enough to cut glass. The young planner nodded quickly and excused herself. Vanessa watched her disappear before finally turning toward me fully. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The soft ballroom music echoed faintly through the hallway between us. "You always did have a talent for making things awkward," Vanessa said quietly at last. I looked at her carefully. Up close, beneath the flawless makeup and expensive jewelry, I could see strain beginning to crack the edges of her composure. "Interesting," I replied calmly. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then, almost instantly, the polished smile returned. "Tonight is about Chloe," she said. "Please do not ruin it because your feelings are hurt." Hurt feelings. I almost laughed. Vanessa still believed this was about emotion, about embarrassment, about family drama. She had not yet realized the most dangerous thing an older woman can become after decades of sacrifice. Observant. Vanessa brushed past me and disappeared back into the ballroom with the same elegant composure she used at charity galas and country club dinners, but the hallway suddenly felt different after she left. Quieter. Colder. I stood there for several seconds staring at the marble floor while distant laughter echoed behind the ballroom doors. $12,000. That was all the venue had received. I tried to calculate the missing amount in my head, but the number itself no longer mattered as much as the realization settling heavily into my chest. Vanessa had not simply lied about me. She had built an entire version of reality around those lies. And somehow everyone around her had accepted it because she wore expensive dresses, smiled at the right moments, and spoke softly enough to sound trustworthy. I slowly walked toward the ladies' room near the hotel lobby, needing a moment away from the music and the endless performance unfolding inside that ballroom. The mirrors inside reflected warm golden light across polished countertops lined with orchids and scented candles. Everything looked immaculate, carefully staged, just like the wedding itself. I leaned lightly against the marble sink and studied my reflection. My silver hair remained neatly pinned. My lipstick had not smudged. From the outside I looked composed. But inside, memories had started surfacing one after another with painful clarity. I remembered Chloe at 8 years old sitting beside me at my kitchen table, while I helped her practice multiplication flashcards, because Vanessa claimed she was too busy preparing for a real estate conference in Las Vegas. I remembered paying for Chloe's braces after Daniel quietly admitted they could not afford the orthodontist payments that year. I remembered driving 200 miles through a winter storm to attend Chloe's middle school choir concert, because neither of her parents could leave work early. Vanessa had hugged me afterward in the parking lot and called me a lifesaver. Back then I believed she meant it. There was a time when I genuinely thought we were family. After Frank died from heart failure 6 years ago, Vanessa showed up every Sunday for nearly 2 months carrying casseroles and lemon cakes from the bakery downtown. She sat beside me in the quiet living room asking about old family stories while Daniel handled paperwork for the estate. Sometimes she even cried while talking about how much she missed Frank. I remember feeling grateful that my son had married a woman who seemed so attentive and caring. Looking back now, I realized those visits stopped immediately after the trust accounts were finalized. The realization hit me with an almost physical heaviness. Vanessa had never attached herself to people emotionally. She attached herself to security, stability, access. And once she secured those things, affection became unnecessary. The restroom door opened quietly behind me, and a young woman in a lavender bridesmaid dress entered while staring down at her phone. She froze briefly when she noticed me standing there. "Oh," she said awkwardly. "I am sorry. I thought this room was empty." I smiled politely and stepped aside so she could use the mirror. She glanced once toward my name tag before quickly looking away. That tiny movement told me everything. Even strangers at this wedding had already been taught who I was supposed to be. The difficult grandmother. The absent elderly relative lingering around out of obligation rather than love. I suddenly understood why Chloe barely looked at me anymore during family gatherings. Why birthday invitations arrived later and later each year. Why Daniel sounded uncomfortable every time he called. Vanessa had been whispering this story into their ears for years, while I kept excusing every slight as misunderstanding or stress. I had spent so much time trying to preserve peace that I never noticed someone quietly erasing me from my own family. The bridesmaid finished adjusting her makeup and hurried back toward the ballroom. I remained standing there alone for another moment before reaching into my purse for my phone. My fingers hovered briefly over my contacts list until I found the number I was looking for. Richard Hale. Frank's attorney. We had not spoken in almost 8 months. I stared at the name on my screen while the muffled sound of wedding applause echoed through the hallway outside. Then very calmly I pressed call. Richard answered on the third ring. Even after all these years, his voice still carried the same calm steadiness Frank used to trust completely. "Evelyn," he said warmly, though I could hear faint restaurant noise in the background behind him. I was not expecting a call tonight. I looked toward the ballroom entrance where soft golden light spilled into the hallway. "I apologize for disturbing your evening," I said quietly, "but I need to ask you something important." His tone shifted immediately, more attentive. "What happened?" For a moment, I almost told him everything. The name tag, the missing money, the slow erasure that had apparently been happening for years while I kept convincing myself the distance inside my family was temporary. Instead, I chose my words carefully. "Do you remember the discretionary family trust Frank established before he passed away?" There was a brief pause. "Of course," Richard replied. "You are the primary trustee. Daniel and Chloe are secondary beneficiaries. Can anyone besides me authorize transfers from the account?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Not legally," he answered slowly. "Why are you asking?" I leaned lightly against the hallway wall while guests laughed somewhere behind the ballroom doors. "I believe someone may have been using my name to imply financial approval I never actually gave." Richard exhaled quietly. "Evelyn, where are you right now?" "At Chloe's wedding." "I see." Something in his voice told me he already understood more than I had explained. Richard had spent 30 years handling wealthy family disputes across Northern California. Men like him developed instincts for trouble long before paperwork confirmed it. "Listen carefully," he said calmly. "Do not confront anyone tonight. Do not sign anything. And absolutely do not allow anyone to pressure you into discussing finances publicly." I closed my eyes briefly. "Richard," I said softly, "how difficult would it be to temporarily freeze pending discretionary distributions from the trust?" Silence settled heavily between us for 2 full seconds. Then he answered with unsettling precision. "Not difficult at all if there is suspicion of misuse or misrepresentation." My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. Somewhere inside the ballroom, applause erupted again, followed by the sound of music swelling louder. The reception speeches must have started. Would it cause immediate problems? I asked. "Possibly," Richard admitted, "especially if someone has been depending on anticipated transfers or reimbursement schedules." I thought about the wedding planner's strained expression, the missing payments, Vanessa's sudden tension in the hallway. For the first time all evening, the pieces no longer felt confusing. They fit together perfectly. Vanessa had likely promised vendors money she assumed would continue flowing through family accounts tied to Frank's estate. She had built an image of wealth and generosity while quietly using resources that were never truly hers to control. And now something was starting to crack. "Can you do it tonight?" I asked. Richard lowered his voice. "Evelyn, if I initiate a temporary review process now, several pending transactions could fail within the hour." I stared through the ballroom doors where hundreds of tiny lights shimmered across white table linens and crystal glassware. Chloe and Ethan stood near the dance floor smiling for photographs while Vanessa circulated gracefully among guests, pretending everything remained perfectly under control. "Then do it," I said quietly. Richard did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried unusual gentleness. "Frank worried about this," he admitted softly. My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "The year before he died, he updated several protections inside the estate documents. He told me he feared certain people valued access more than family." I swallowed hard. Even now, 6 years later, Frank somehow still understood this family more clearly than I did. "I thought he was being overly cautious," Richard continued. "Perhaps he was simply observant." I looked down at the gold-lettered name tag still pinned to my jacket. The absent old lady. Vanessa probably thought it was clever. A subtle humiliation disguised as humor. But standing there in the quiet hallway while attorneys reviewed trust accounts and financial authorizations behind the scenes, I realized something she had failed to understand about older women. We survive by learning to sit quietly while paying attention. And eventually, attention becomes power. Richard cleared his throat gently. I will handle everything from here, he said. But Evelyn, once this begins, there is a strong chance tonight will not end the way your family expects. I glanced one last time toward the glowing ballroom before answering calmly. I do not believe it already has. I returned to the ballroom slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket before stepping back into the golden light and carefully orchestrated joy. Nothing looked different at first glance. Guests still laughed around candlelit tables. Servers still moved gracefully between chairs carrying trays of wine and tiny desserts topped with edible gold flakes. Chloe and Ethan had started their first dance beneath soft white spotlights, while several people wiped tears from their eyes watching the young couple sway together. It looked beautiful from the outside. That was the danger of polished families. The ugliness always lived underneath the presentation. I walked quietly back toward my table near the rear corner of the room. Margaret looked up immediately the moment she saw my face. "You look calmer," she observed softly after I sat down. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. "I am," I replied truthfully, and strangely enough I was. Earlier that evening, humiliation had clouded everything. But clarity changes the temperature of pain. Once you understand someone completely, their cruelty stops feeling personal. It simply becomes predictable. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood near the wedding cake, speaking animatedly with two women from Ethan's family. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the entrance as though expecting something. Or someone. Her smile remained flawless, but I noticed the way she kept checking her phone whenever she thought nobody was watching. 10 minutes later, the wedding planner approached her again. This time their conversation looked less pleasant. Vanessa's posture stiffened immediately, while the planner held out a tablet screen showing something that caused the color to drain slightly from Vanessa's face. Even from across the ballroom, I recognized the expression. Panic trying to remain elegant. Vanessa quickly forced another smile and nodded several times before pulling the planner farther away from nearby guests. Margaret followed my gaze carefully. "Something is wrong," she murmured. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I believe it finally is." The pianist transitioned into a slower song while guests returned to their conversations, mostly unaware of the tension beginning to spread quietly beneath the surface of the reception. But certain people had started noticing. A florist near the entrance stood whispering urgently with one of the hotel managers. Two catering employees kept checking their phones with increasingly anxious expressions. Tiny fractures were appearing inside the illusion Vanessa had spent years constructing. Daniel suddenly appeared beside our table looking distracted and pale. "Mom," he said quietly, "have you seen Vanessa?" I looked up at my son calmly. "Not for several minutes." He rubbed the back of his neck, the same nervous habit he developed as a teenager whenever he was overwhelmed. "Something weird is going on with the payment accounts," he admitted under his breath. "Several vendor authorizations are suddenly being flagged." Margaret lowered her eyes politely toward her wine glass while I studied Daniel's face. He looked genuinely confused. Not manipulative. Not calculating. Just tired and lost. For years I blamed myself for his distance, wondering what I had done wrong as a mother after Frank died. But looking at him now, I realized Daniel had spent so much time trying to survive Vanessa's constant control, that eventually he stopped questioning her version of reality altogether. It was easier that way. Easier to surrender than challenge the person organizing every detail of his life. "Did Vanessa explain what happened?" I asked gently. Daniel exhaled sharply. "She said the bank probably froze a transfer because of fraud protection." He laughed nervously, though there was no humor in it. Apparently the timing could not be worse. No, the timing was perfect. Across the ballroom, I spotted Chloe near the dance floor speaking quietly with Ethan. Her smile had faded now too. She looked worried, glancing repeatedly toward her mother while guests continued pretending not to notice the growing tension in the room. It struck me suddenly how young she still looked beneath all the bridal makeup and diamond jewelry. Young enough to believe confidence always meant honesty. Young enough to mistake manipulation for strength. Daniel pulled out the chair beside me and sat down heavily. "Mom," he said after a long silence, "can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." He hesitated before speaking again. "Did Vanessa ever say anything to you about helping with the wedding expenses after your initial contribution?" There it was. the first crack in his certainty. I looked directly at my son. Daniel, I said carefully, how much money do you believe I contributed to this wedding? He blinked. 12,000, I think. I nodded slowly. I gave your wife $40,000. The silence that followed felt enormous. Daniel stared at me as though he had misheard the words entirely. Somewhere behind us, guests continued applauding another toast while crystal glasses clinked beneath the chandeliers. But at our table, everything had suddenly gone still. Daniel's face lost what little color remained. That is not possible, he whispered. Vanessa showed me spreadsheets. Then perhaps, I replied softly, you should start asking yourself why those spreadsheets needed to exist at all. Daniel stared at me across the candlelit table as though the room itself had tilted beneath him. Around us, the reception continued with artificial elegance while tiny fractures spread quietly through the evening like cracks beneath frozen water. A waiter approached holding 2 champagne glasses, but Daniel waved him away distractedly without even noticing what he was doing. 40,000, he repeated softly. Mom, that cannot be right. I held his gaze steadily. I transferred the money directly into Vanessa's account 6 months ago. She told me the venue required immediate deposits to secure the date. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face slowly. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the chandelier light as he lowered his eyes toward the tablecloth. She never told me that, he whispered. I believed him. That was the tragic thing. Daniel was not cruel the way Vanessa was cruel. He was passive. There is a difference. Cruel people create damage intentionally. Passive people simply allow it to happen because confrontation exhausts them more than guilt does. Across the ballroom, the wedding planner hurried toward the hotel manager again, both of them speaking in hushed, urgent voices while trying unsuccessfully to appear calm. Guests had started noticing now. Conversations paused whenever employees crossed the room too quickly. Ethan's parents stood near the bar looking visibly uncomfortable. Even the musicians seemed distracted, glancing toward the side entrance every few minutes while continuing to play soft jazz arrangements nobody was really listening to anymore. Then Vanessa appeared again. This time, she was no longer floating gracefully through the ballroom like a woman in control of her perfect evening. Her smile looked strained now, stretched tightly across panic. The moment she spotted Daniel sitting beside me, she changed direction immediately and walked toward our table with measured determination. There you are, she said sharply, though she quickly softened her tone once she noticed Margaret watching quietly nearby. I have been looking everywhere for you. Daniel looked up slowly. Did Mom give you $40,000 for this wedding? The question landed between them with startling bluntness. Vanessa froze for only half a second before recovering. Daniel, not now. Answer the question. Several nearby guests glanced toward our table before pretending not to listen. Vanessa leaned closer to him, lowering her voice tightly. Your mother is confused about the accounting structure. I almost smiled at that. Confused. Elderly women are always supposedly confused the moment our memories become inconvenient for younger people. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, he said quietly. You told me she only covered a small portion of the flowers. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly. Because that is what was budgeted publicly. I was trying to avoid embarrassing your mother by making her contribution look larger than it actually was. The lie arrived so smoothly it almost sounded rehearsed. But this time something had changed. Daniel no longer accepted her explanations automatically. Doubt had entered the room, and doubt is dangerous once it begins breathing. Vanessa, he said carefully, where did the rest of the money go? Her eyes flickered briefly toward me. Cold. Calculating. Then she straightened her shoulders. I am not discussing private financial matters in the middle of Chloe's wedding reception. Before Daniel could respond, the wedding planner suddenly approached the table again, visibly flustered. Mrs. Collins, she said nervously, I am terribly sorry, but the hotel accounting department needs immediate authorization regarding the suspended transfer notifications. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly like someone fighting to remain composed. I already told you the bank is resolving it. Unfortunately, the planner continued carefully, the florist and catering manager are requesting confirmation tonight because several vendor balances now appear frozen pending legal review. Legal review. The words landed heavily in the air. Daniel turned slowly toward me. Margaret lowered her wine glass without speaking. Around us, nearby conversations began fading into awkward silence, as more guests sensed something serious unfolding beneath the polished surface of the reception. Vanessa forced out a brittle laugh. "This is absurd," she said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "There must be some clerical misunderstanding." But even as she spoke, her voice lacked conviction. I watched her. Carefully then. Really watched her. For years I had mistaken her confidence for intelligence. But true intelligence stays calm under pressure. Vanessa only knew how to control situations where nobody questioned her version of reality. And tonight, for the first time in years, people were starting to ask questions she could not easily charm away. Daniel stood up slowly from his chair. "Did you use family trust funds for this wedding?" he asked quietly. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief, as though she could not comprehend that he had finally stopped standing automatically beside her. "Excuse me," she whispered. "You heard me." The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the music seemed softer somehow. Vanessa looked around at the watching guests, at the anxious staff members, at the wedding planner clutching her clipboard nervously beside the table. Then finally her eyes settled on me. And for the first time all evening, I no longer saw superiority in her expression. I saw fear. The silence around our table spread outward slowly, like ink bleeding through paper. Guests who had been laughing moments earlier now pretended to focus very carefully on their champagne glasses or dinner plates while secretly listening to every word. Vanessa stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, one hand wrapped tightly around her phone while the other rested against the back of an empty chair. Her breathing looked shallow now, controlled, but barely. Daniel remained standing across from her with an expression I had not seen on my son's face in years. Clarity. Painful clarity. "Answer me honestly," he said quietly. "Did you use money connected to Dad's estate without telling me?" Vanessa gave a short disbelieving laugh. "This is unbelievable," she whispered. "You are seriously questioning me in front of everyone because your mother suddenly wants attention?" The cruelty of the statement did not surprise me anymore. What surprised me was Daniel's reaction. He did not defend her. He did not turn toward me with embarrassment or frustration the way he usually did whenever tension appeared inside the family. He simply looked tired. Deeply tired. "Mom has never wanted attention," he replied softly. "That is probably why this went on so long." Vanessa's face hardened immediately. For a brief second, the polished social mask disappeared completely, revealing something sharp and desperate underneath. "You have no idea what I have managed for this family," she snapped under her breath. "The schedules, the appearances, the networking, the expectations. None of this would exist without me. None of this would exist without her," Daniel answered, glancing toward me for the first time all evening with visible shame in his eyes. Across the ballroom, Chloe finally noticed the tension gathering near our table. She excused herself from Ethan's relatives and hurried toward us, carefully lifting the hem of her wedding dress as she crossed the marble floor. "What is happening?" she asked nervously the moment she arrived. Vanessa turned immediately toward her daughter, voice softening again with astonishing speed. "Nothing, sweetheart. There is just some confusion with the accounting department." But Chloe was no longer looking at her mother. She was staring at Daniel instead. "Dad." Daniel ran one hand through his thinning hair slowly. "Your grandmother gave far more money for this wedding than we were told." Chloe blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" Nobody answered immediately. Around us, guests had stopped pretending not to notice. Even the musicians seemed distracted now, the piano melody growing hesitant and uneven in the background. Finally, I spoke quietly. "I paid $40,000 toward the wedding 6 months ago." Chloe's expression changed instantly. Shock first, then disbelief. "Mom told me you only wanted to contribute a little, because retirement had become difficult after Grandpa died." Vanessa stepped forward quickly. "Chloe, this is not the time for financial discussions." But Chloe kept staring at me. "Grandma," she whispered, "is that true?" I nodded once, very calmly. Her eyes filled slowly with confusion as memories clearly began rearranging themselves inside her mind. I watched her glance toward the slideshow screen still displaying carefully selected family photographs, then toward my seat hidden in the back corner of the ballroom, then finally toward the name tag still pinned to my jacket. Understanding arrived all at once, and it hurt her. You said she never wanted to be involved, Chloe said softly to Vanessa. You said she always kept her distance. Vanessa's composure cracked visibly then. Because she did, she insisted sharply. Do not rewrite history just because she suddenly wants sympathy tonight. Before Chloe could respond, the hotel manager approached accompanied by 2 employees carrying tablets and paperwork folders. His polite smile looked strained beyond repair now. Mrs. Collins, he began carefully, I am very sorry, but several vendors are requesting immediate clarification regarding suspended payments connected to the Harper Family Trust review. The word review echoed heavily through the ballroom. A few guests actually gasped quietly. Vanessa turned pale beneath her makeup. What review? She demanded. The manager hesitated. Our accounting office was informed approximately 30 minutes ago that pending transfers connected to discretionary estate distributions have been temporarily frozen pending legal authorization verification. I watched realization hit Vanessa with brutal force. Her eyes snapped toward me instantly. Not with superiority this time. Not even with anger. With panic. Real panic. Because for the first time all evening she finally understood something important. I was no longer sitting quietly at the back of the room hoping to remain included in a family that barely noticed me. I was paying attention now. And people who survive long enough eventually learn that quiet attention can dismantle entire performances. The ballroom no longer sounded joyful. The music still played softly near the dance floor, and waiters still moved between tables carrying untouched desserts, but the warmth had vanished from the room entirely. Conversations had fractured into nervous whispers, while guests avoided direct eye contact with one another. The perfect wedding Vanessa spent months constructing was quietly collapsing beneath the weight of truth. Chloe stood frozen beside our table, one hand pressed lightly against the fabric of her gown. While tears gathered in her eyes, she kept looking between me and her mother as though trying desperately to reconcile 2 completely different versions of reality. Grandma, she said softly, why did you never tell me any of this? I looked at her carefully. Even now, she still seemed so young beneath the layers of makeup and expensive jewelry. Frank used to say that children believe the loudest voice in the room until life finally teaches them otherwise. Because I thought love was supposed to be quiet, I answered gently. And because I kept hoping your mother would stop turning family into competition. Vanessa inhaled sharply. This is unbelievable, she snapped. You are trying to humiliate me at my own daughter's wedding. I almost smiled at the irony of that sentence. Daniel lowered himself slowly into the chair beside me, looking older than I had ever seen him. Vanessa, he said tiredly, please stop. But she could not stop. People like Vanessa never stop once the performance begins collapsing. They simply grow louder. Do you honestly think any of these people would even be here without me organizing everything? She demanded. Without me managing this family for years while everyone else sat back pretending to be victims? Several guests shifted uncomfortably nearby. Ethan's parents exchanged tense glances near the bar. The hotel manager quietly stepped away with the wedding planner, clearly deciding the family disaster unfolding before them no longer required their involvement. Vanessa looked around the ballroom desperately, searching for support that no longer existed. Then her eyes landed on the projection screen still cycling through family photographs overhead. Suddenly Chloe turned toward it too. For a long moment, she simply stared at the images flashing across the screen. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies, smiling family vacations, carefully edited memories with almost no trace of me anywhere. You removed her, Chloe whispered. Vanessa blinked rapidly. What? You removed Grandma from everything. Her voice cracked softly. You made it look like she was never there. Vanessa opened her mouth immediately, prepared with another explanation, another polished lie, another carefully arranged version of reality. But Chloe shook her head before she could speak. No, she said quietly. I remember now. The room fell silent again. Chloe wiped beneath one eye carefully, trying not to ruin her makeup. Grandma drove me to school every morning in 7th grade because you said your yoga classes were too important to miss, she whispered. Grandma stayed with me after my wisdom teeth surgery, Because you left for a business conference. More memories surfaced visibly across her face with every sentence. Grandpa Frank paid for my first car. Vanessa's composure cracked completely then. Chloe, stop this right now. But Chloe stepped backward slowly instead, as though finally seeing her mother clearly for the first time. Daniel lowered his head into his hands while the weight of years settled visibly across his shoulders. And standing there beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by expensive flowers in frightened silence, Vanessa suddenly looked very small. Not powerful. Not elegant. Just frightened. Frightened because manipulation only works while people still believe the story. I reached up calmly and removed the gold-lettered name tag from my jacket. The paper felt strangely light between my fingers now. For hours, those words had sat against my chest like humiliation. But suddenly they no longer mattered at all. I placed the tag gently onto the tablecloth beside my untouched champagne glass and rose from my chair. Margaret stood immediately beside me. Daniel looked up with red, tired eyes. "Mom," he said quietly, "I am sorry." I studied my son for a long moment. Then I nodded once. "I know," I replied softly. Across the ballroom, Chloe began crying quietly while Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Vanessa remained standing alone beneath the glowing chandeliers, surrounded by collapsing illusions and half-finished lies. I picked up my purse carefully and walked toward the ballroom exit without another word. No one tried to stop me this time. As the cool Monterey night air touched my face outside the hotel doors, I realized something unexpected. I did not feel abandoned anymore. They had spent years trying to erase me from the family story, while quietly living on the sacrifices I made for them. But in the end, the truth remained simple. I was never absent. I was the foundation holding everything together.